Mike Rodriguez had been living in Pleasant Hills for 3 years. Every Saturday morning, he'd wake up early, grab his fishing gear, and head to the community lake. He loved watching the sunrise reflect off the water while he cast his line, hoping to catch bass or bluegill for breakfast. That morning started like any other. Mike pulled on his lucky fishing hat, checked his tackle box one last time, and headed out. The air was cool and crisp as he walked down his street, nodding to neighbors who were retrieving their morning newspapers. The lake was just a 5-minute walk from his house, and he could already see the peaceful water through the trees. But something felt different today. As Mike approached his favorite fishing spot near the wooden pier, he noticed a woman marching toward him. She was wearing an expensive-looking tracksuit and carrying a clipboard. Her hair was pulled tight in a bun, and her smile looked more like a grimace. "Excuse me," she called out sharply. "Sir, you there with the fishing pole?" Mike turned, surprised. "Good morning. Are you talking to me?" "Yes, I'm Karen Stevens, president of the Pleasant Hills HOA Board. I need to see your authorization paperwork immediately." Mike felt confused. He set down his fishing pole and reached for his wallet. "Sure, I have my fishing license right here. It's valid for—" "Not your fishing license," Karen interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Your special lake usage permit. Don't you know that fishing in our lake requires advance written permission from the HOA board?" "A special permit?" Mike's eyebrows raised. "Ma'am, I pay my HOA dues every month." The welcome packet said all residents can use the community amenities, including the lake. Karen's pen clicked repeatedly as she spoke. "That policy was updated 6 months ago. We sent out a memo. All recreational fishing now requires a permit application submitted 2 weeks in advance. Catch and release only, specific hours, designated areas." "I never received any memo," Mike said slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. "And I've been fishing here every weekend since I moved in." "Ignorance isn't an excuse," Karen declared, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. "I'm issuing you a violation citation. That'll be $250. You have 30 days to pay, or it doubles." Mike felt his face flush with frustration. $250 for fishing in my own community lake. This is ridiculous. Rules are rules, mister. Karen peered at her clipboard. "Rodriguez, Pleasant Hills is an exclusive community, and we maintain our standards through strict enforcement. Can I at least speak to the board about this?" Mike asked, holding up his wallet. "Look, here's my receipt for this month's HOA dues. I've paid on time every single month." "The board meets in 2 weeks," Karen said curtly. "Your appeal can be submitted in writing. For now, you need to leave the lake area immediately or face additional fines." Mike's shoulders slumped. He'd been looking forward to this peaceful morning all week. Now his day was ruined, and he was facing a massive fine for something he'd done countless times before. He slowly packed up his tackle box, his hands shaking slightly with anger. As he turned to leave, he noticed movement on the porch of the house next to the lake. An elderly man was sitting in a rocking chair, watching the whole scene unfold. The man was thin with wispy white hair, wearing a faded U.S. Army veteran cap and a plain button-up shirt. He slowly raised his hand in a gentle wave to Mike. Mike waved back half-heartedly before trudging home. The morning sun that had seemed so beautiful earlier now felt harsh and mocking. He couldn't help but think about how unfair this whole situation was. $250 for fishing. He paid his dues religiously. He followed all the rules. How could they suddenly add new requirements without proper notice? The elderly man watched as Karen marched away victoriously, still scribbling notes on her clipboard. Then he looked back at Mike's retreating figure and shook his head slowly. He'd lived in this house longer than most people had been alive, and something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. He made a mental note to look through some old boxes in his attic later that afternoon. Boxes he hadn't touched in decades. That afternoon, Mike sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers. He'd spent hours searching through his filing cabinet for any mention of the new fishing permit policy. Nothing. He pulled up every email from the HOA. Notices about holiday decorations, reminders about pool hours, warnings about leaving trash bins on the street, but absolutely nothing about fishing permits. "This is crazy," he muttered, pushing his reading glasses up his nose. He opened a new browser tab and typed HOA fishing permit requirements Pleasant Hills. The search results showed various complaints about the HOA from neighbors, but nothing specific about this policy. Frustrated, Mike decided to research the HOA's actual authority. He clicked through the county assessor's website, looking up property records for Pleasant Hills. As he scrolled through parcel numbers and tax information, something caught his eye. The lake's boundaries seemed oddly specific, almost like someone had drawn them with a ruler. He printed the map and compared it to the neighborhood layout he had from when he bought his house. The discrepancy was clear. The county's official map showed the lake extending into areas marked as private property on the HOA's community plan. "This can't be right," Mike said to himself. He grabbed a highlighter and marked the differences. According to county records, about a third of the lake wasn't even on HOA property. His phone rang, startling him. It was his friend Dave, a local real estate attorney. "Hey Mike, heard you got in trouble with the HOA today. Karen Stevens already posted about it in the neighborhood Facebook group." "She what?" Mike groaned. "Says you were violating community rules. You know Karen. She loves her drama. Listen, I've dealt with these HOA disputes before. Have you checked the actual deed restrictions for your property?" Mike hadn't thought of that. After hanging up, he called the county recorder's office. The clerk, Mrs. Patterson, was helpful and patient as she explained how to access deed information online. 20 minutes later, Mike was printing out deed records dating back to 1975. He spread them across his dining room table like a detective solving a case. The original subdivision plat showed something interesting. The land where the lake now sat was originally owned by different people, not consolidated under one HOA umbrella. The doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, Mike could see his neighbor, the elderly man who'd been watching from the porch that morning. Mike opened the door. "Good afternoon, son. Name's Frank Thompson," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Been watching you fish these past 3 years. Always wondered why nobody else used that eastern shore." "Mr. Thompson, hi, I'm Mike Rodriguez. Sorry you had to witness that scene this morning. Mind if I come in? Got something you might find interesting." Mike invited Frank inside and offered him coffee. As they sat at the kitchen table, Frank's eyes landed on the spread of maps and documents. Still fighting Karen and her HOA nonsense. Frank chuckled. "You know, I bought this house in 1978. Moved here right after Vietnam. The lake wasn't even a lake back then." "What do you mean?" "There was just a little stream running through. Old man Peterson, who owned all this land before the subdivision. He dammed it up to create a pond for his cattle. When the developers came in the 90s, they expanded it into this fancy lake." Mike leaned forward, intrigued. Something Frank had said triggered a thought. "Mr. Thompson, Frank, do you remember where exactly your property line is when you bought this place?" Frank scratched his chin. "Well, I know I pay taxes on my whole lot. Haven't checked the boundaries in years, though." "Why do you ask?" Mike pulled out the county assessor's map and pointed to the highlighted sections. "According to this, the eastern part of the lake might be on your property." Frank's eyes widened. He stood up, grabbed his reading glasses from his shirt pocket, and studied the map closely. "Well, I'll be darned. You know, I always wondered why my property taxes were higher than my neighbors. Thought it was just because of my bigger backyard. How long have you been paying taxes on this lot?" "Every year since '78. That's, let me think, 45 years. Never missed a payment." Mike's mind raced. If Frank had been paying property taxes on land that included part of the lake for 45 years, that was continuous possession. In their state, that could establish ownership through adverse possession laws. Frank, do you have your property tax records? The old ones, especially. The next morning, Mike arrived at Frank's house with 2 coffees and a folder full of notes. They sat at Frank's kitchen table, which was covered with old documents that smelled like mothballs and memories. "I've been thinking about this all night," Mike said, pulling out his phone to record their conversation. "We need to get everything organized before we take any action." Frank nodded, reaching for a dusty box he'd brought down from the attic. "Found my old military documents, too. Figure if we're going to do this right, we better have everything in order." They started with the oldest papers first. Frank's original property deed from 1978 clearly stated the lot boundaries: 200 feet northeast from the existing property line, including all water rights and mineral rights. The description was precise, using landmarks like the old oak tree that still stood near Frank's shed. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to a faded notation on the deed. "It specifically mentions stream and future water development rights." The original owners knew exactly what they were selling you. Frank pulled out another document. "Here's my first tax bill. See how it shows 2.3 acres? That's way more than just my house lot. They've been collecting taxes on lake property for decades." Mike photographed each document with his phone, making sure to capture every detail. They found Frank's original survey from 1978, hand-drawn by a local surveyor named William Hughes. The map showed the natural stream running right through what was now Frank's property. "Dad always said Hughes was the best surveyor in the county." Frank reminisced. "Never made a mistake in 40 years of work." By noon, they had created a timeline. In 1975, the land was owned by the Peterson family, who had farmed it for generations. Frank bought his parcel in 1978. The developers came in 1995, forming Pleasant Hill subdivision and expanding the small pond into a lake. The HOA was established that same year. The missing piece is what happened between 1978 and 1995, Mike said, tapping his pen on the table. "We need to see if anyone tried to negotiate with you about the lake expansion." Frank stood up slowly, his joints creaking. "Actually, I do remember something. Wait here." He disappeared into another room and returned with a yellowed envelope. "Got this in my mailbox in 1994. Thought it was junk mail at the time." Inside was a letter from Peterson Land Development Company. It offered Frank $500 to sign away any and all claims to water rights on the eastern boundary of his property. At the bottom, a handwritten note read, "Mr. Thompson, as a veteran, you deserve fair treatment. Please consider this generous offer." "Did you sign anything?" Mike asked. "Nope. Never even responded. $500 seemed like a joke for giving up part of my property. Plus, I was going through a rough patch after my wife passed. Wasn't thinking clearly about business matters." Mike's eyes lit up. "This is huge. They knew you had rights to the water, and they tried to buy you out cheaply. When you didn't respond, they just went ahead anyway." They continued searching through Frank's papers. They found annual property tax documents showing he'd paid on the full 2.3 acres every year. They found old photographs of Frank fishing in the stream before the lake expansion. They even found a certificate from a 1988 community fishing derby, where Frank had won Best Catch for a 5-pound bass. "Look at this," Frank said, holding up an old aerial photograph. "My stepson took this from his Cessna in 1992. Shows the property lines clear as day." The photograph was perfect. It showed Frank's house, the stream, and most importantly, the old survey stakes that marked his eastern boundary. Those same stakes would have been removed during construction of the larger lake. By evening, they had compiled 3 boxes of evidence. Mike's dining room table became their war room, with documents sorted by date and relevance. They created a clear paper trail showing Frank's continuous ownership and tax payments since 1978. The original survey showing his land extended into the lake area. The developer's attempt to buy his water rights for $500. photographic evidence of the original property boundaries, 45 years of uninterrupted property tax records. Tomorrow, I'll call the county surveyor's office, Mike said. We need to get an official modern survey to confirm what these old documents show. Frank leaned back in his chair, looking more energetic than he had in years. You know, Mike, I spent my whole life never causing trouble. Paid my taxes, followed the rules, minded my own business. But this HOA, they've been bullying people for years. Remember when they made the Johnsons tear down their kid's swing set because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing? Mike nodded. He remembered many incidents. Hefty fines for grass being half an inch too long, complaints about Christmas decorations in January, threats of lions for minor violations. Karen Stevens seemed to take pleasure in enforcing every tiny rule. I think it's time someone stood up to them, Frank continued. And if it takes an old veteran with 45 years of tax receipts to do it, then so be it. As Mike gathered the documents to take home for scanning, Frank walked him to the door. The lake was visible from Frank's porch, glowing orange in the sunset. 3 ducks swam peacefully across the water. My property, Frank said quietly. All these years, I thought I was just the guy living next to the lake. Turns out, part of that lake has been mine all along. We'll set this right, Mike promised. Every single person who got a fishing fine, every family who couldn't enjoy the lake, they deserve to know the truth. That night, Mike worked late into the evening. He scanned every document, creating digital backups. He researched similar cases in their state, finding legal precedents where long-term tax payments established property ownership. He even found a newspaper article from 1996 about the lake's grand opening, which mentioned negotiations with existing property owners, but failed to specify whether all negotiations were successful. At 2 a.m., Mike finally closed his laptop. Outside his window, the lake was dark except for the security light near the pier. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring justice. But for now, Mike slept soundly, knowing they had the truth on their side. Frank, in his house by the lake, sat in his recliner looking through old photo albums. Pictures of his younger self in uniform, his late wife in her Sunday dress, grandchildren visiting from out of state. He flipped to a page showing him fishing in the stream that became a lake. Underneath, in his wife's neat handwriting, Frank's lucky fishing spot, July 1985. Lucky indeed, Frank whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow, he would prove just how lucky that spot really was. Early the next morning, Frank's phone rang. Mike had already called Thompson and Associates Surveying Company, the oldest surveying firm in the county. The owner, Bill Thompson Jr., still remembered Frank from when his father worked with him in the old days. I'll be there this afternoon, Bill promised on the phone. If it's anything like what you described, this could be big. At 1 p.m. sharp, Bill arrived in his white pickup truck, packed with surveying equipment. He was a sturdy man in his 50s, wearing the same style of boots his father had worn decades earlier. Frank watched from his porch as Bill unloaded his tools. Mr. Thompson, Bill called out, approaching the porch. My dad talked about you for years. Said you had the neatest property lines of any client he ever surveyed. Mike arrived minutes later, carrying coffee and sandwiches for everyone. They spread the old survey documents on Frank's dining room table. Beautiful work, Bill said, examining his father's 1978 survey. These measurements are precise to the inch. Dad always said good surveying is about respect for the land and its owners. Bill spent the next 4 hours methodically working. He set up his equipment at the exact points his father had used 45 years earlier. Modern technology made the work faster, but the principle remained the same. Frank followed him around the property, pointing out landmarks mentioned in the old survey. By late afternoon, Bill had his preliminary findings. He gathered Frank and Mike on the back porch, his face serious but his eyes gleaming with professional excitement. Gentlemen, according to my measurements, Mr. Thompson owns everything his 1978 survey claimed. That includes approximately 38% of the current lake's surface area and the entire eastern shore. Are you absolutely certain? Frank asked, his voice trembling slightly. I'll run the final calculations tonight. But yes, I measured from 3 different reference points, using both modern GPS and traditional methods. The results are identical. Your property line extends 200 feet into the lake, exactly as the original deed states. Mike took detailed notes while Bill explained the technical aspects. Property boundaries, water rights, adverse possession laws. Everything pointed to Frank's ownership. The surveyor promised to have official maps ready by morning. I should warn you, Bill added, packing his equipment. Once we file this with the county, things might get complicated. HOAs don't like discovering they've been managing property they don't actually own. That evening, Frank called his niece Patricia in Phoenix. She was a real estate lawyer who had helped him with his will a few years back. After hearing the story, Patricia immediately booked a flight for the next day. Uncle Frank, this is potentially huge. You're talking about property rights, water access, and what sounds like attempted fraud. I'm bringing my partner, Mark. He specializes in property disputes. The next morning arrived with unexpected drama. Karen Stevens had apparently heard rumors about the surveying. She marched up to Frank's door at 7 a.m., clipboard in hand, and 2 HOA board members in tow. Mr. Thompson, I hear you're making wild claims about lake ownership. This is preposterous and needs to stop immediately. Frank, still in his robe and slippers, simply smiled. Good morning, Karen. Beautiful day for surveying, isn't it? You can't just claim parts of our lake. The Pleasant Hills HOA owns all common areas, including... Actually, Mike interrupted, stepping out from Frank's living room, where he'd spent the night going through documents. The HOA bylaws clearly state ownership of common areas as defined by official county records. Want to see what those records say? Karen's face reddened. This is ridiculous. We'll see what our lawyers have to say about this nonsense. I hope you do, Frank said calmly. My niece arrives this afternoon. She's bringing quite a bit of paperwork you might find interesting. Later that morning, Bill Thompson Jr. returned with the official survey results, stamped and certified. He handed Frank a manila envelope like he was delivering a winning lottery ticket. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. As of today, you own the largest private property in Pleasant Hills. Patricia and Mark arrived at noon, immediately diving into Frank's boxes of documents. Patricia, a petite woman with fierce determination, reminded Mike of a bloodhound when she caught the scent of injustice. This is cleaner than most cases I handle, she said, examining the 1978 deed. Continuous tax payments, clear boundary descriptions, failed negotiation attempt. They tried to lowball you and then proceeded anyway when you didn't respond. Mark, her partner, focused on the legal timeline. In this state, paying property taxes for more than 10 years establishes presumptive ownership. You've been paying for 45 years. That's not just ownership. That's practically consecration of property rights. By evening, they had drafted a formal notice to the HOA. The letter was clear and professional, outlining Frank Thompson's rightful ownership of lake property, HOA's unauthorized use of private property, request for immediate discussion of arrangements, warning that failure to respond would result in legal action. Patricia reviewed it one final time. We're giving them 7 days to respond. That's more than generous. Frank signed the letter with steady hands. As he did, he thought about all the years he'd watched people fish, swim, and enjoy his lake without knowing it belonged to him. He'd never minded the noise or the activity. But the fines, the excessive rules, the way Karen treated people like they were children, that needed to stop. That night, as the lawyers slept in Frank's guest room and Mike worked on his laptop at the kitchen table, Frank sat on his porch. The lake was quiet except for the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, his shore. Tomorrow, the certified letter would reach the HOA. Tomorrow, everything would change. Looking at the reflection of stars on the water, Frank wondered what his father would have said. Probably something simple, like, "Son, the truth always comes out eventually." He could almost hear his wife's voice too, soft in the evening breeze. "Frank Thompson, you finally stirred the pot after 71 years on this earth." But some pots needed stirring, some battles needed fighting, and some truths needed telling. The lake rippled in the moonlight, as peaceful as ever. But beneath its calm surface, the waters of change were rising. The following week felt electric in Pleasant Hills. Word of Frank's property discovery spread faster than the neighborhood's famous gossip chain. By Tuesday, Karen Stevens had received the certified letter. By Wednesday, she'd called an emergency HOA board meeting. The community center's parking lot was packed on Thursday evening. Usually, only 10 people showed up for board meetings. Tonight, over 100 residents crowded into the room. Frank sat in the back corner with Patricia and Mark, while Mike stood near the side door. Karen Stevens banged her gavel so hard it splintered. "This meeting is to address a serious threat to our community's integrity." Murmurs filled the room. Most residents still didn't know the full story, just bits and pieces of rumors. "Someone has challenged our rightful ownership of Pleasant Hills Lake," Karen continued, her voice sharp. "This claim is completely baseless and threatens everything we've built here." Board member Robert Chen, a retired engineer, raised his hand. "Karen, I've reviewed the documents. The survey seems legitimate. We should discuss this calmly." "Legitimate?" Karen's voice cracked. "They're using technicalities to steal our lake." A hand shot up from the audience. It was Dorothy Martinez, who'd received 3 fines for letting her children play too loudly near the lake. "If someone owns the lake, who's been collecting our HOA fees for lake maintenance all these years?" The room buzzed with questions. People started connecting dots. Excessive fines, sudden rule changes, threats of legal action over minor violations. "Mr. Thompson," Karen pointed her gavel at Frank, "would you care to explain yourself?" Frank slowly stood, using his cane for support. Patricia touched his arm supportively. "I moved here in 1978, bought my house fair and square, and paid my taxes every year since. I never made trouble for anybody. You're the one who started checking property lines." "By fining me for fishing," Mike added. "Maybe if you hadn't been so eager to punish people, nobody would have looked into the property records." The room erupted. Residents started sharing their own stories of HOA fines and harassment. The Johnsons spoke about their swing set drama. The Paddles mentioned being fined $500 for planting unauthorized flowers. The Browns faced a lion for having a doormat the wrong color. Karen's face grew redder with each testimony. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Enough," Karen shouted. "This meeting is about property boundaries, not past decisions." Patricia stood up gracefully. "Actually, it's about both. My client has owned portion of this lake for 45 years, while unknowingly allowing the community to use it. But the HOA has been collecting fees for maintenance. They don't have the right to charge and issuing fines for activities on private property." Mark produced a folder thick with documents. "We've calculated the value of lake access, maintenance fees collected, and fines issued. We're looking at approximately $75,000 in misappropriated funds over the past 10 years alone." The room fell silent. Karen's hand shook as she gripped her gavel. "However," Patricia continued, "Mr. Thompson is a reasonable man. He's not interested in ruining this community. He's interested in fairness." Frank stayed standing. "I'm willing to work something out, but things have to change around here. The fines, the rules, the way you treat people, it's got to stop." Board member Susan Park cleared her throat. "What exactly are you proposing?" "First, drop all current fines," Frank said. "Second, we negotiate a fair lease for the lake. Third, the HOA board reevaluates all its policies, especially those related to lake usage." Over the next hour, chaos turned to collaboration. Residents who hadn't spoken at meetings in years voiced opinions about HOA governance. Karen Stevens tried to maintain control but gradually lost ground as even her fellow board members began agreeing with resident concerns. Finally, Robert Chen proposed a vote. I move that we form a special committee to work with Mr. Thompson on a solution that benefits everyone. All in favor. Hands shot up throughout the room. Karen looked around in disbelief as her authority crumbled. The motion passes, Robert declared. Karen, I think it's time we discussed your leadership style. By 9 p.m., 3 revelations had transformed Pleasant Hills. Frank owned the lake's eastern shore and 38% of its surface. The HOA had been operating beyond its authority for years. Residents were tired of Karen Stevens' iron-fisted management. As people filed out, many approached Frank to thank him. Mike's fishing buddy, Dave, whispered, "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but thank God for property taxes." Outside in the parking lot, Patricia and Mark reviewed their notes. "Uncle Frank, you handled that beautifully. They're desperate to avoid a lawsuit." "I don't want lawsuits," Frank said, watching the moonlight dance on the water. "I want my neighbors to feel safe in their own community again." Mike walked them to their cars. "Karen will probably resign by next week. I heard Susan Park and Robert Chen talking about a complete board restructuring." That night, as Frank prepared for bed, he found himself reflecting on unexpected turns. He bought this house seeking peace after Vietnam, wanting nothing more than quiet mornings and friendly neighbors. Now, somehow, he'd become the center of community revolution. The phone rang just as he was turning out the light. It was Karen Stevens. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. I've been overzealous in my enforcement. I thought I was protecting property values, but I realize I've been protecting ego more than community." Frank sat on the edge of his bed, surprised. "Karen, we all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do moving forward." After hanging up, Frank smiled in the darkness. Change could come from the most unexpected places, like a simple fishing trip on a sunny morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and negotiations, but tonight, Pleasant Hills felt different. The lake, with its secrets finally revealed, seemed to rest more peacefully under the stars. And Frank Thompson, accidental hero of property rights, finally closed his eyes, content with what one honest mistake had uncovered. In the neighbor's house, Mike Rodriguez updated his community Facebook page. Pleasant Hills Lake, coming soon under new management. Fair rules for all. The next morning would indeed be different in their subdivision. The lake would keep its name, but its future belonged to the community, officially, legally, and finally, respectfully. 2 weeks after the explosive community meeting, Pleasant Hills buzzed with a different energy. Karen Stevens had handed in her resignation, citing personal reasons. The remaining board members, Robert Chen, Susan Park, Thomas Wright, and newly elected member Dorothy Martinez, scheduled another meeting to finalize negotiations with Frank. This time, the atmosphere was friendly, almost celebratory. Frank arrived with Patricia, carrying a folder of his own. Residents gathered outside the community center, many bringing coffee and cookies like it was a weekend social. "Before we begin," Frank said at the start of the meeting, "I want to make one thing clear. I'm not here to take anything away from this community. I'm here to make things right." Patricia laid out the proposed settlement terms. First, Mr. Thompson will lease the lake and surrounding 200 feet to the Pleasant Hills HOA for $500 per month, plus a one-time payment of $10,000 to cover unintentional use of the past 5 years. This is far below market value. A lake comparable to yours would typically lease for $2,000 monthly. The board members nodded appreciatively. Robert Chen did a quick calculation on his notepad. Second, all current resident fines will be canceled, especially those related to fishing and lake activities. A small cheer went up from the audience. Dorothy Martinez smiled widely. Third, $5,000 of the annual lease payment will be designated for veterans' memorial maintenance and community veteran programs. Mr. Thompson has personally experienced how veterans can be overlooked in their later years. The room grew quiet with respect. Everyone knew Frank had served, but few had asked about his experiences. Finally, the HOA will review and update all lake-related rules by January next year. No permits required for fishing. Noise restrictions only for late-night fishing after 10 p.m. Fair warning for minor violations before any fines. Susan Park spoke up. These terms seem incredibly generous, Mr. Thompson. You could have demanded much more. Frank leaned back in his chair. Susan, I've lived next to this lake for 45 years. I've watched children learn to fish here, couples get engaged on that pier, and families picnic on these shores. Being technically right isn't worth destroying what this lake means to people. The vote was unanimous. Robert promised to have the official documents drawn up by the following week. After the meeting, something unexpected happened. Residents lined up to speak with Frank, not just to thank him, but to share memories of the lake. The Johnsons mentioned their daughter catching her first fish there. The Browns recalled moonlight swimming on warm summer nights. Even the controversial Patels showed photos of their unauthorized garden, now thriving by the lake's edge. Mike Rodriguez waited until the crowd thinned. Frank, there's something you should see. He led Frank to the pier, where someone had mounted a small plaque. In honor of Frank Thompson, fishing friend to all. Who put this here? Frank asked, his eyes misty. Honestly. Mike smiled. I don't know. I found it here this morning. Patricia returned from her car with a thick envelope. Uncle Frank, here's the first lease check. The HOA board wants to make this official immediately. Frank opened it slowly. $10,000. The back payment. But attached was a note. Use this however you wish for the community. Thank you for your service, to our country and to Pleasant Hills. That evening, Frank called a real estate contact. By midnight, he'd made arrangements to purchase 3 large umbrellas and comfortable chairs for the pier. He also donated the $10,000 to the local VFO hall in memory of his late wife. The following weekend, the HOA held what they called the New Beginning Barbecue. Over 100 families gathered around the lake. Children swam and fished without fear of fines. Adults laughed without looking over their shoulders for clipboard-bearing board members. Karen Stevens surprised everyone by attending. She brought potato salad and approached Frank hesitantly. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly. The doctor says my blood pressure has normalized since stepping down. I didn't realize how stressed I'd become trying to control everything. We all learn, Frank replied gently. Some of us just take longer than others. Mike grilled burgers while Dorothy's husband set up speakers for afternoon music. Thomas Wright, the re-elected board treasurer, handed out new rule books, thin pamphlets replacing Karen's 50-page manual. The new guidelines fit on 2 pages. Be considerate. Be safe. Enjoy your community. As sunset painted the lake gold and pink, Frank sat on his porch with Patricia and Mark. They decided to add a codicil to his will. After his passing, the lake property would. 6 months after the fishing fine that changed everything, Pleasant Hills had transformed. The lake shimmered differently now, not because nature had changed, but because every resident saw it as a symbol of community rather than control. Frank Thompson's mailbox never held fines anymore. Instead, it overflowed with thank you cards, neighborhood children's drawings, and invitations to potlucks. Every Saturday morning, he still woke early for fishing, but now he had company. What started as Mike joining him had grown into a regular group of 5 veterans who gathered at the pier. Tom Wilson, a Gulf War veteran, brought stories and coffee. Sarah Chin, the first female vet in the group, taught everyone about fly fishing. Big Jim Parker, who served in Desert Storm, always packed extra tackle boxes for beginners. And Johnny Miller, the youngest of them, just released from active duty, found peace in their quiet camaraderie. You know, Big Jim said one morning, baiting his hook, I haven't felt this relaxed since before. Frank understood. War left invisible scars that peaceful mornings by water could slowly, gently heal. The monthly lease payments Frank received went right back into the community. The $5,000 Veterans Fund had already bought new memorial flags, sponsored a traveling wall replica visit, and provided grocery gift cards for elderly vets struggling with fixed incomes. Each month, Frank added something new to the lake area: benches for tired fishers, a small dock for children to safely feed ducks, solar lights that made the path safer for evening walks, birdhouses to attract more wildlife. Every improvement came from his pocket, no HOA approval needed. The new board had flourished under gentler leadership. Robert Chen implemented an online portal where residents could suggest rules rather than just follow them. Susan Park started monthly coffee chats where people could raise concerns informally. Dorothy Martinez created a second chance policy. Minor violations received warnings rather than instant fines. Karen Stevens, surprisingly, became their biggest success story. Without the pressure of constant enforcement, she volunteered for Community Garden Club. Her green thumb, previously directed at critiquing lawns, now helped residents learn about native plants suitable for lakeside growth. Mike Rodriguez's fishing fine had been the last one issued in Pleasant Hill's history. The HOA eventually returned $15,000 in fines to residents who could prove excessive penalty payments. Many donated their refunds to Frank's Veterans Fund or local charities. One June morning, as Frank sat on his porch with morning coffee, a black sedan pulled up. A woman in her 30s stepped out, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the State Veterans Administration. I heard about what you've done here." Inside Frank's living room, Jennifer explained, "We'd like to feature Pleasant Hills as a model community for veteran integration. Your veterans program by the lake. It's exactly what we've been trying to encourage across the state." Frank felt overwhelmed. "Ma'am, I just wanted my friends to have a peaceful place to fish." Sometimes, Jennifer smiled, the most meaningful changes start with simple wishes. She left paperwork for a potential state grant, $50,000 to expand the veterans program. The money could fund fishing equipment for outreach to VA hospitals, sponsor trips for disabled veterans, and create an adaptive fishing pier for those with mobility challenges. That afternoon, Frank gathered his fishing group to share the news. The 5 veterans looked at each other, then at Frank, expressions mixing surprise with hope. "We have a condition," Frank said, signing the grant application. "The program must welcome any veteran, regardless of when or where they served. No wars are worthier than others." Johnny Miller, who'd been the quietest member of their group, spoke up. "My grandfather was a Korean War vet. Never talked about it. Died alone. This would have meant everything to him." By August, the Pleasant Hills Veterans Fishing Program made local news. The video showed Frank teaching a wheelchair-using veteran to cast from the new adaptive pier. Behind them, the lake glistened peacefully. The HOA board framed the article for their office wall, proof that communities thrive when people care about each other more than enforcement. One September morning, as autumn painted the trees around the lake, Frank found a letter left on his doorstep. No address, just to the hero of the lake. Inside, a child's handwriting. "Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for letting us fish. My mom says you are the nicest man in the world. I caught 3 fish last week. Can you teach me how to make the line go far? Your friend."